Um, Hi, hi everyone. If everyone's ready, we're gonna start with the design and technology lectures today. I'm gonna do an introduction for today's lectures. All right. Welcome to the College of Architecture and Design at Lawrence Technological University. And welcome to those joining online through our YouTube channel. My name is Taka. I teach visual communications for the first year architecture and design students, and also the advanced design studio for the architecture graduate students. At the college, we believe that future of design is multidisciplinary, and we host a range of design degrees that include graphic design, industrial and transportation design, game design, interiors and architectures. We track design future trends, emerging technologies, and advancements in practice as a means of crafting education approaches in these areas. Our design and technology lecture series allows us to engage in design discussions and offer broad perspective on where we are headed. Our next lecture will take place on November 8th at 12:30 p.m. We are thrilled to present Brian Lee Jr., founder and design principal of Colloquiate Design, who will speak on the power and place. And for co-ed students, on November 10th at 12:30 p.m., please join Holly Roddenberry for the final wood bending workshop, Curve Bending for the Curvature. And please register for both free events by visiting our co-ed's webpage. And now I am very excited to introduce today's speaker of co-eds for 2022 Design and Technology Lecture Series, Perry Kulper. Perry is architect and associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan. Prior to teaching at Michigan, he was a SciArc faculty member for 17 years and held visiting teaching positions at UPenn and Arizona State University. Subsequent to graduate studies at Columbia University, he worked in the office of respected mentors, Eisenman and Robertson, Robert Stern Architects, and Venturi and Scott Brown Architects before moving to Los Angeles. His primary interests include the raw and generative potential of architectural drawings, the outrageous different spatial opportunities offered by using diverse methods in design practices, and in widening the conceptual range by which architecture contributes to our cultural imagination. He was the Sir Bannister Fletcher Visiting Professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London in 2018 to 2019. In 2013, he published Pamphlet Architecture 34, Fathoming the Unfathomable, Archival Ghosts and Paradoxical Shadows with friend and collaborator Nat Cherd. They are at work on a new book to be published by UCL Press soon. Recently, he optimistically ventured into the world of digital, attempting to get a handle on cut and paste and magic wand operations in Photoshop. As a result, he has encountered one of his steeper learning curves. Even more recently, he has also been snooping around under the hood of said digital areas. Fantastic beasts have also been on his mind. He lectured and conducted workshops at countless universities throughout the world. Perry was my thesis mentor at the University of Michigan. I have never met anyone more invested in teaching, and he always has students' best interest at his heart. He was, and still is, always up for a chat to talk about ideas and work that students are interested in working on. To this date, we continue to talk about working on the work and things that interest us. Perry was one of the main inspirations I started getting into teaching. So all the first-year students who are in Viscom suffering, he's the root cause of that, your suffering. And he continues to teach, and he continues to inspire the next generation of architects and designers. And today, Perry will speak on surface wanderings. At the end of the lecture, we'll have time for a 15 minutes Q&A sessions. So with that, please help me welcome Perry Kulper.
Thanks. Do you want me to use this? You want me to use this? Okay. Thank you very much, Taka. It's amazing to be here. I have to say that I'm very, very touched by Taka's introduction because I've probably I've been fortunate. I don't know. I've lost count, but probably to teach 2,000 or so students. And he is one of the 3 or 4 most memorable in my entire teaching career. So thank you, Taka. And thank you to Carl and the school for the invitation to turn up and share some thoughts with you. I'm going to set up some key principles in terms of things that I think about when I both teach and work. I'm then going to show a couple of publications of student work just to give you a sense of what a very, very small percentage of students have worked on at Michigan with me. I've been fortunate to be asked to publish student work in a number of books and journals, and I'll just show you a couple of them just so you get a sniff. And then I'll sit out the less interesting work, I was going to say more interesting work, my own, and try to just build a visual atmosphere of things that I've done over a period of time. The talk is called Surface Wanderings, and so if people know me, they know me probably for the drawings that I make. Often early ones were layered, mylar, a lot of time spent on them, and the drawing for me has been an incredibly I'm still in architecture because of architectural drawing. And I'll try to allude to at least why that's the case as I work through some of the images. All disciplines use representation, all disciplines in the world. So representation is a glue that holds essentially culture together. And architectural representation, I think, has potential far, far, far beyond what we normally teach about, think about, and work on in practice. So anyway, the drawings have been a big deal for me. And it's literally the reason that I'm still in architecture, because it allowed me to think, the drawings allowed me to think about things in ways that I hadn't been able to before, and actually work on those things and believe that they could be structured in spatial realms somehow. So surface wanderings, I think of myself as an amateur. And I wander, I get curious about things, and I just wander through drawings and visualizations, sometimes objects, to try to discover what might be possible. So wanderings is something that I like to do. These are, if there are big picture things that I would maybe like to leave you with, these are they. I just mentioned that architecture is a discipline that touches all disciplines. First and foremost, it must be generous. Second, everyone in the room, you may think of yourselves as architects in training, and that's maybe what you are, or other schools in the room. You're actually cultural agents of change, and you need to believe in that. And otherwise, you just turn up in shops and just do things that everybody else does. And architecture is an agent in the world that we live in, And you are, I would think of yourselves as cultural agents, not professionally trained architects only. Education and practice must be active construction. So schools that matter are always actively constructing and transforming themselves. It means that students, faculty, and staff are always in the business of helping to construct the school, not just doing decent work and assignments and so on. Those places are contributing probably far less when that's the mandate. You're doing assignments and turning up and doing good work. It's much, much more than that, in my opinion. And I've been fortunate, I've probably been to about 85 schools in the world for different things and taught at 4 or 5 of the best schools in the world, to be honest. And I know what it means to help construct a place. It's essential that you take on that responsibility and don't just turn up and take classes and do work. I mentioned my larger project ultimately probably tries to augment the picture plane or one-point linear perspective developed roughly 600 years ago, Florence-ish. There are lots, that's a lecture, that's probably a book, The Role of the Picture Plane and the Subject and Mediated Representation of the World, where you're not living in the world any longer, you can represent it on a picture plane. That's a long discussion, but I believe the picture plane is responsible, let's say, for capitalism, for spatial setups for 600 years and so on. There's nothing wrong with it, but it has lots of embedded values and histories which are highly both useful and problematic. So my project is partially to deal with that. The other 2 key things that I try to work on would be how we work. I care enormously how we work. That is design methods specifically. People have said that I'm the only one that they know who really talks about actually work. And I'll touch on 14 design methods that I've articulated and blah, blah, blah. But for me, it's architecture 101, how you work. I don't go to a surgeon and say, please work on my heart. And he or she says, I don't know how to do that. I don't have methods to do that or techniques to do that. We're just it's an odd training that we have. We don't expose how we work explicitly. The values, the histories, the ways authors interface with design methods and so on. So that's something that I care about a lot. Representation techniques belong to design methods. Design methods are sort of the meta structures by how we work. Representational techniques, whether that's 2D, 3D, 20D, I think we're involved in 20D now. The techniques allow us to encompass or encounter design methods, and methods allow us to work on stuff. And then the conceptual breadth. Architecture is very, very narrow in my opinion. I'm trained as an architect, I'm a licensed architect, I paid fees for 39 years. I believe in architecture as a profession and a discipline, but it's very, very narrow, in my opinion, with respect to what its potential capacities are. So I'm interested in broadening how we think about spatial settings, let's say. I don't use the word building almost ever. I don't use very often architecture. I use spatiality. That can include architecture and building, but it's also, for me, the naming of things is really problematic. I've got lots of, it's like a sofa here, and Dr. Freud's near me, I'm confessing. The naming problem is really, really, for me, challenging because it basically pushes us into default positions when we work. So for example, if I ask you to design a foyer, that project is already 95% finished by me mentioning that 5-letter word. It's 2 stories high, it's an information counter over here, there's a bank of elevators there, there's an exit stair behind it, and they probably came in behind where you're standing. So there's nothing wrong with naming, but it really clips the wings of what's possible. I'm going to give you a simple example. If I ask you to design a house, great, let's work on that. There are probably going to be bedrooms, bathrooms, kitchens, garage, living room, and so on. But if I ask you to work on conditions of hygiene, the privatization of sexuality, certain domestic rituals, and so on, that's still a house, but it allows you to work on what structures domestic settings rather than confirming what the name already expects you to do. That make sense? So I care a lot about relational structuring. It's basically all I work on. How things are structured relationally in temporal worlds. That is the type of relationships, the strength of relationships, and the temporal or durational structure of relationships. This will make you say, what the hell is the guy talking about? Let's just eat pizza and get out of here. I'll give you a simple example. When I was at SCI-Arc, this is when the big change happened for me. I was teaching at SCI-Arc and I came into the school. It was about 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, and I walked by a garbage can, trash can. Got them everywhere. No one was in the building. I looked at the trash can, and all of a sudden it wasn't an object anymore. It was traces of histories and paper production and deforestation elsewhere. There was a lot of paper in there at the time. So I began to understand that it was a relational field as much as it was an object. That's the way I work on architecture, work with students, work on my own work. So just to get some key things out on the table so you know where some of my values lie, that's to put the cards on the table. Now I'll move much more quickly. So we finish on Tuesday and not Thursday. I've been asked, a lot of people have asked me to make a book of my own work. As I began to think about that, I thought, well, what would I talk about? And so I began to make, I'm a list character. I make lots of lists. They help me keep track of stuff. I began to make a list of things which I care about or have cared about in the construction of both my practice and the way I teach. And they move from the big ticket items like grounding in the history of ideas. Architecture is always grounded in the history of ideas. Developments in optics, language, technology, religion. We're always in touch with those things, whether we want to be or not. So they move from sort of big ticket items to things like disciplinary questions, the ethics, moralities, and values of schools, different ways to structure schools, to structure pedagogical logics. There are lots of those, lots of ways to do those things. Blah, 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 blah. So these are sort of it's a bit of bodybuilding for maybe something like a book of my work, which will probably be organized around 13 bird motels. And I'll tell you why that's the case in a minute. It's also really, really important for me to identify and keep track of things, places, conceptual frameworks, people that have been influential for me. So I have lots of these. And with each of those items, I can go in and select probably 3 or 4 key things in which this world has been important to me. So I just try to keep track of things that interest me, that have been influential for me, and so on. This is the palette by which I operate on a piece of work when I'm working properly. The last time I worked properly was 2012, when I worked on pamphlet architecture with my friend Nat. To put my cards on the table again. These are things I care about a lot when I work. So relational structuring, I went through these 3 things, generative potential of representations, design methods, and large conceptual breadth. Then I've got a number of peri things. The naming problem, the roles that things like situations or sites and programs play. So I don't assume that programs are functional always. They can play rhetorical roles, sacrificial roles, they could be tropes for other things and so on. So I care, I'm not going to go through these, but I care about, this is sort of a checklist for things when I'm working properly. I want to see which things are in play, and then I want to try to care for what I call the mechanics of engagement. That is how all the parts of a piece of work diagrammatically work together. I'm going to be much quicker. Well, I don't know if it'll be more interesting or not. Everybody in the room, if you're interested in becoming, let's say, design, you want to be a designer, let's say, this is a way in. These are 14 methods which I've identified. Some people say that content of form is mine. It's not probably, but I don't know that name elsewhere. If you produce 14 pieces of work, if you took a program, let's say a house, and you worked analogically, appropriation through automatic practices and so on, you would produce radically, radically, radically different work. by attending to those different methods and what they afford and what they limit. I would encourage you to pay attention to how you work, no matter what you're doing. Teaching in grade school, working in a practice, doing multiple things. It matters a lot. No one taught me about this. I offered a studio at SCIARC in 1999. The studio was focused on design methods. So I sort of locked in and said, okay, this to me matters. We won't go through these. To increase your formal and material vocabularies, which is essentially what architects do, appropriation is the fastest way to do that. Just appropriate things. Download models, put them together, find things that interest you, put them together. You can get out of your way quickly. That's mostly what I try to do when I work. I try to get out of my own way. I try to break my own habits because I'm not interested in doing the same project. It doesn't interest me at all. And I'm not interested in doing other people's work because they're much better at it. So design methods allow me to some versatility. This is to do with versatility and plasticity as a designer, let's say. We use them combinatorially, we can make them up, and so on. It has to do with working on things more effectively. Super encouraging to think about appropriation. The other one that gets you quickly down the road is analogic means, through likenesses. The skin of the building is going to be like the chaps of a Western cowboy crossed with the game of Go. That's what the skin of the building is going to be like. Say, huh? So in analogic thinking, these are the two methods that will get you to, if you're interested in broadening what you do, those two methods will allow you to do that. Analogic thinking allows you to think outside of yourself through likenesses to other things. I'm going to organize, and when you work analogically, they can have more or less specific goals. So you can work analogically just to work analogically. I'm going to organize a house like the game of Go crossed with a soccer match from 1895. You can just do that off the top of your head, and that's worthwhile doing. The other part of it is you can really target analogic thinking. These are some things I'm thinking about, some ideas, and I think, circuses operate that way. So I begin to look at circuses and how they're organized and blah, 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 and that may help me figure out what to do. Methods. I won't go through these. These are things about drawing that I care about. Wallace Stevens' great poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, has been enormously influential for me. And if you don't know the poem, it's worth knowing for the following reason. In the 13 stanzas of the poem, Wallace Stevens builds the world of the blackbird as only illusions or adjacent to the blackbird. He never says that's the thing. By the end of the poem, you have an incredibly broad sense, but very, very specific sense about what a blackbird might be. So when I work on work, I often try to look at work from 13 different, not perspectives, meaning visually, 13 different value structures. When I work, I make decisions at a lot of levels. And if I do it, I will admit that I think my best work is decent. I'm not sure that I've ever made a really good piece of work, but when I work properly, I make decisions at a lot of levels. So for example, I make decisions about what the work says at cultural levels, what it says about me as a teacher, what it says about the discipline, what it says about me personally, and what it says relative to a situation that I'm working in. And a situation could be the Bible, or my thumbnail, or a site across the street. Situations. When you work in school, you work on sites generally. It's fine. Situations allow a much greater range of conceptual possibility by just thinking about situations that allow you to work on things you want to work on that aren't already, let's say, known. Blah, blah, blah. So there's some drawing things, and then I also keep track of things that I do. There are real consistencies, from form grammars to multiple languages, representational languages in the same thing, to the way I frame language, blah, 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 blah. There are lots of things that I do, and I mostly try to keep an eye on these to make sure that if I'm doing them in a piece of work, that they're appropriate or relevant or interesting at least. That's what my work table looks like when I get ready to work. So I have a very, very specific discipline when I work on my table. The way I set up my workspace, the references around me, clean the tools, the way I put things into place, that matters to me because there's potential in that in my world. That's another kind of a workspace. Taka mentioned Photoshop. I don't know, I can answer emails and I can do, there are a few things that I can do in Photoshop and I'll show you a few images. I stink at it basically. But that's a workspace for me. This is also a kind of workspace, Instagram. And I've been able to form lots of friendships and opportunities and find interesting work and so on. How many people on Instagram out there? Some of you? Yeah. Instagram is, between Instagram and Midjourney, architectural education is being radically altered as we speak. And that's another talk probably, but it's a big deal. I'm going to show you, just as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to show you a few student projects. There's a recent issue of AD, Architectural Design, which is, I think, one of the great, in my opinion, one of the great journals in the world. My friend Neil Spiller happens to be the editor, and he asked 13 educators from around the world to basically foreground student work. Great. This has been out a year and a half, maybe. So I'll just show you the pages. I'm not going to read. But what I want to look at, is it in there? And then this, sorry, so that's, I've been invited to do another, I've been fortunate to publish a fair bit, and there's another AD coming which has to do with ghosts. Anyway, in the school we published, there's a publication called Gradient, and these are some thesis projects. This is just the layout for Gradient. Member of the committee, we have a great design group in Switzerland that did this. These are some of the images from thesis work in particular, and a small description of those pieces of work. The work, I don't know, I've been here a couple of times for reviews, but I don't know the work as well as I would like, but I know it's intense and you do good work here. We also get plenty of good stuff at Michigan. I just want to notice this page on the left. I'm really interested in it, but I don't know who made the work. I sort of lost track of that. But I think he introduced me. This guy in the back of the room, he brings a piano into the studio. Okay? No worries. I'm basically going to take it apart, he says. Okay? And he produced an extraordinary piece of thesis that belongs to both the piano and taking it apart and coding things and rebuilding it and all kinds of other things. Then there are a bunch of other things that belong to his work as well. So I'm super happy to talk with Taka during that time. I'm going to launch into my world, which is less interesting always than school students. Amongst many things, I'm interested in working at different speeds. So I'm going to share with you, these are projects that are organized according to 7 categories that I think of as contemporary categories. Material, fabrication, production, atmospheres, change and flux, and I'll roll to the next page and there are 4 more. These are projects materializing the space of construction of a building rather than the building. These won't make sense to you. X-ray architecture, chronohybrids, temporally active spatial species. These are projects. I won't do them, I'll never do them. But they're projects that allow my conceptual and imaginative range to be broadened by doing things like this. Build the plan here and the section over there. So these are little ditties for me, which are projects that keep me alive in terms of what I think is possible. There are lots of these. Now I'm going to shift it. You're going to see it. I'll show you a bunch of images now. So in the early 90s, when I was teaching at SCIARC, we would take students to the desert for a week. We'd camp out, sleep under trucks, tents, and so on. I realized we were doing projects in the landscape, first-year graduate students. And I realized I didn't know anything about the landscape. I'm trying to teach about it. So what I started to do is one-a-day landscape drawings. These are 18 inches by 24 inches. And for the first 6 weeks, I made one a day. Get up, shower, eat, and make one. It was at 5:36 in the morning. The longest ones are an hour and a half. Shortest ones are probably half hour. So I was living, my former wife Amy was doing a PhD at Cambridge in England. I was teaching at Penn. I was living in Cambridge part of the year, and I was teaching at SCIARC. So it was hard to do one a day. I was just moving a lot. Anyway, there are 750 of these. I'm going to take them up again. I make them in series. The smallest series is 4. The largest series is 35. Everybody in the room, I'd recommend one a day. Doesn't matter what. Fold paper, an interesting piece of paper. Make a series of marks. Make one a day. You'll accumulate knowledge and develop expertise about something and a curiosity, which is critical. So I made, yeah, they're just images of some of those drawings. When I finished, I was teaching at Penn and was working for with Denise Scott Brown and Bob Venturi in the very late 80s. The only way to leave the office, I was fortunate to be implicated. Bob Venturi trusted me. He trusted everybody, but I worked very, very closely with him. The only way to leave the office when you worked closely with Bob in particular was to move as far away as you could. So I put a compass on the map and I swung it out and it hit San Francisco and LA, and I said, I'm going there because I need to leave the office. And anyway, when I went out to be an architect, I had a project, a guest house in Montecito, Santa Barbara, California. I was invited to an international competition for a house based on a 15th century text. And I made 5 proposals in 5 weeks. And this is the final proposal. And then I had a real project, a desert house in Southern California. And I always remember this. I worked about 600 hours on it, and I got paid $800. Don't do that. Don't ever do that. Because you'll continue to get paid $800 rather than what you should be properly paid to do work. Anyway, none of these projects got built. I just worked through a series of drawings. On this one, I made the plan. I'll go back. I made that plan. I drew that plan at 1/4 inch equals a foot 32 times on vellum to get it right. It's just the nature of the work. I then, as my conceptual breadth started to develop, I said, I wonder if I could build all 32 of those as one house. Because all the marks had value in this iteration, and the next one. I thought, I wonder if I could build all 32 of those. What would that look like? Anyway, none of these got built. And I realized there's one more project that when Amy was in Cambridge, we lived in a very, very small house, very narrow, about 3.5 meters wide. And I designed a room essentially for that house. And that's what this is, a room for that house. It's got a leather floor, and it's got a double aquarium, and it's got a steel cactus wall. It's got a rubber basement, and it's got all kinds of things to do with heaven and hell and street life and a cemetery and so on. But as a result of making these pieces of work, I realized that there was no way I had enough imagination, spirit, drive, interest to last for 50, 60 years in the discipline. So there's no way. I just don't have enough range. The project seemed fine. 1990, all of them. So I said, that's trouble. Because if I want to be an architect, that's what I want to do, but I don't have the gears to do that. I don't have that. So I then made a second version of that desert house, the last one, the graphite drawings, the smudgy graphite drawings. These are what I called aspectival drawings. They're to do with the critical fragments of the house, they're not plans or sections or elevations, they're critical fragments. So these are the genetic structure for the next version of that house. The drawings started to open up a little bit to me. I was trained on plans, sections, elevations, perspectives, axonometrics, diametrics, and so on. That was the way I was tooled. Fantastic, zero wrong with those things. But for me, I couldn't work on certain kinds of things that mattered to me. So I began to open up in the mid-90s then the architectural drawing more in a competition for an island, which I didn't enter because my father died while I was working on it. So, you know, the health and family, always before school, always. Anyway, these are the initial marks in the drawing. Just to give you a sense, this is about the size. They're not quite this big. These drawings are 24 by 36. And what I was interested in doing was three things in the drawing. I'll show you the drawing, the image of the drawing. I was interested in seeing if I had about 12 or 15 key ideas for the project to do with maritime ecologies and mythologies, things to do with military suppression, things to do with panoptic and panoramic vision, the history of islands. There were a bunch of ideas. And as a way to gather them up, I tried to use the drawing to begin to speculate on programs that might support those kinds of ideas, for example. So for example, there's an axis of mutiny, there's a silver shell surface, there's a multiplied officers headquarters, no fly zones, there are landings for mythical sea travelers and so on. Those are linked to content. That's the first thing I tried to do. I tried to invent programmatic logics that would contact the content, the ideas, the structure of the work that I had in mind. The second thing I wanted to do was to begin to use multiple families of representation simultaneously. So there are language, there are diagrammatic parts to this, there are figurative things, there are mapping techniques and so on. So I realized that my schooling, my training as an architect and in school was homogeneous relative to the languages of representation. And I wasn't good enough, I'm not good enough still to get the lions to hop to the same platform at the same time. In other words, I can't convert, when I'm thinking about things, I can't draw a plan and say, okay, I got everything. So mixed languages of representation allowed me to keep things in play which I was certain about, other things which I just had a hunch about, other things that I didn't know whether they'd be in play at all. The third thing I began to think about was I considered the drawing as an object that had content regardless of islands and mythological characters and blah, 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 blah. That the drawing had capacity in its own right, that it had ways to speak back to me and I to it. Sounds corny to say it that way, but there's a negotiation with the drawing itself, regardless of what I'm thinking about. So those were three big ticket items for me that have carried with me in other kinds of work that I'll do. Now I'm going to scoot through things much more quickly. So that was the technical drawing of the architectural components. In this project in 2001, I started a competition for a museum in Central California. Lots of research, paying attention, ideas, and so on. And I continued work on the architectural drawing. This is what I call a thematic drawing, basically identifying the key ideas of the project. Then there are a series of drawings that I call cryptic site drawings. They're basically the chromosomal or genetic, the DNA of the project. They're not figural, they're not material, but they have indications of what might come geometrically or figuratively. These are, again, 24 by 36 inches. The drawings are made, these kinds of drawings are made in layers, like the David's Island. Drawing probably has 6 layers. Animal x-rays and foil and cut paper and pieces from film boxes and drawn parts and so on. So these are generally layered. This is a piece of the museum which is related to the Greek muses. And this is a proto-formal, what I call a proto-formal drawing for that element in the museum. This is a proto-formal section through one of the key architectures in the site. And then a few years later, often when you see digital models and renderings, they will have been worked on with former students. So Sin Lu helped me here, and we modeled very, very quickly a kind of a sketch for what that museum might be. And I won't go into it because that's not consequential relative to what I'd like to share with you today. I've been interested in erasure as an architectural and spatial technique as well as representation. Architects always add value. They always add materials. So I said, what would happen if I worked through erasure, removing, flattening, bleaching out? So I started what I call relational drawings for a house. These aren't plans or sections or perspectives or not anything like that. They're relational drawings where I'm just working on erasure and recoding. So often when I work, because of some of the complex things going on, I'll isolate things that I need to work on, like erasure. I'm not working on a house, I'm just trying to work on erasure. The drawings are 50 to 60 hours a piece. They're worked heavily. There's some marks that are put in to be stand-ins for furniture and outlets and rituals, practices, and domestic realms, and then they're systemically erased and recoded. So they're just relational drawings. The project didn't get complete. I was working, at the time I was at SCI-Arc, I was working hard on things, but I wasn't working quickly. So I decided to develop a house that I called fast twitch. We have fast twitch and slow twitch muscles. I'm a cyclist, high amateur level when I was younger, and my slow twitch muscles were super good, but my fast twitch muscles were not. That was true in design as well. So I decided to work analogically on a house that I call fast twitch for the desert. All the projects have these, sketchbooks essentially. I don't own I've never owned a sketchbook. These are sketchbooks for me. This project has about 60 pages that belong to the development of the project. The way I worked quickly was to work analogically. So there are garden surfaces that are like empty game boards. There are pieces of the work that are like cuckoo clocks. There are blah, blah, blah. So I work always through likenesses. And the key ideas, a lot of things, I started with ground, sky, and horizon. So you got too many ideas generally. Start super simply. And of course, I developed all kinds of other things to do with cryptic, historically grounded sublime languages and hybrid archetypes and so on. Anyway, it's essentially, there's an idea about the whole site is milled. This is 2004. So the landscape is being milled by landscape milling machines. These garden surfaces are milled by those machines. I'll just describe what the pieces are. You eat in there, you sleep in there, and that space is filled with logs. And you live in two baskets. On the outside of that. That dematerializes over 100 years. The steel is calibrated, so it dematerializes under these kind of logs 100 years. There's a labyrinth that you can't get into. It has a red object that you can't ever see, but you can hear it. It has a cast bronze miniature biplane. It has chrome shadows for the big objects. They're on the ground. And in those chrome shadows are inscribed pieces of architecture that were never there. There's a chrome billiard ball. There's an object that sits inside of this and comes out on occasion, and there's a pink press garden. This piece moves across that pink press garden back and forth, patrolling it when no one's there. So those are the descriptive pieces. Then we just made it again. This is to design this properly is probably another 200-300 hours to design it as a sketch. Anyway, you can see the chrome shadows. So there's an interest in multiple temporalities. So the chrome shadows have one temporality which is different than the sun. Then these cryptic languages which are described in the garden surfaces. Blah, blah, blah. You sleep in these cuckoo clock-like vessels that sit inside that angelfish piece. This is a stair that goes to nowhere. It's 3 inches wide at the top. And it goes to just the top of the angelfish piece. Doesn't matter. Their idea is hitched to these things. It's just okay to do that. Then there are a whole series of erasures on the architecture, and then the erased pieces get displaced in the landscape and becomes the end. And we use that. Yep. Rather than this. In addition to. In addition. Okay. Is that better? Better? Okay. Thank you. Anyway, just some renderings. So here's the log-filled piece. You live here, and there's a miniature version of the proposal built on the side. You live here, and there's a miniature version of the proposal built on the side of the living space, and there's a mechanical hawk. that belongs to that model. I've been very, very, very fortunate, grateful, humbled to be invited to lots of things. The year our daughter was born, 6 weeks after she was born, I was invited to the Prague Biennale, and I was asked to deal with architecture as a transient phenomenon. So I worked with 3 former students. It's a 15-foot long object that we shipped to Prague. It's put together like a puzzle. This is the base of it, the digital base. And it has gold leafing and drawn parts and text on it that got added to it. Anyway, I won't go into the ideas. This is a really, really fun project. At Michigan, we used to have what we called research through making, and you could apply for funding. I did that in 2009, and I was interested in crossbreeding landscape types, garden landscape types, landscape elements, and landscape biologies or landscape temporalities to see whether there was a way to discover an alternative way to think temporally in architecture. So we made, with a former student again, Justin, we made hundreds of visualizations. We got $20,000 for the grant. I spent $4,000 because I was too busy with other things and gave $16,000 back to the school. Don't ever do that. I just was involved in too many other things to allocate that money. There are resources, people out there. If you want to support your work, there are people out there who are willing to do it, for sure. In the school, perhaps. I don't know that. Anyway, we made some drawings of test tube berms and zipper blooms and fabric predators and so on. Got invited by my dear friend Gretchen Wilkins, who was a head at Cranbrook now, along with 29, I think, other architects in the world. We were asked to make 2 pages in a book and then pass it on in 2 weeks to someone else in the world. So to do with documenting urbanism. So I made a piece of work, about 2 pages, that I called Alchemic Urbanism. My good friend Nat Chart, who Taka mentioned, we were going to work on a piece of work to do with the Titanic. And so I made a series of drawings where I began to autopsy, essentially the National Geographic images of the Titanic. And then there's another set of thinking that goes with that has to do with things that float around the ocean and harbor animals and reflect strange sky conditions and so on. I was asked by a friend of mine, Jim Barton, to make the first image for an online journal called Edge Condition. Erasure, one of the most important painters to me in my development is Johannes Vermeer, the art of painting. And I wondered if through erasure, I could develop the art of architecture. So just a series of drawings, of which those are some. With my dear friend Coy Howard, teaches at SCIARC, he's probably taught at SCIARC 45 years. For what he's up to, is the best designer in the world. And so we worked on a series of houses, a series of speculative rooftop houses, of which these are just in process drawings. And Taka has recently photographed these, but I'm just showing you the in-process thing. So we worked on these in 2002 and 3, just when SCIARC moved downtown to the train depot, because we didn't know anything about downtown. We said, let's do some work. So we speculated rooftop houses. There was a big sort of market above Broadway. There were some sonic monuments that we imagined, restructuring some facades. We had 7 projects, and we worked on one of them, speculative rooftop houses, of which these are plans. They're not very good images, but yeah, they're unusual. I would say these are unusual if we were to be able to build them. Anyway, I've also been interested in building envelopes. So I used my David's Island project and wonder if a building envelope could be like that. So these are analogic drawings. There are 6 of them teed up. I'll show you 2 of them. That's what a work table looks like. This one's based on medical imaging technologies. So I work all over the place. I work on things that interest me now because I have tenure. And I can do that. I've always done that, but I work on things that I'm curious about. So in this case, I'm interested in dismantling, again, literally the picture plane, So there's a floor triptych, which is being worked on, and then there's a ceiling piece. And those things discuss the spatiality, not lateral vision, let's say. Nat and I won Pamphlet Architecture 34, as Taka said. We were very, very fortunate and grateful. A very, very dear friend of ours, mine particularly, Mark Stanley, designed it for us. So Pamphlet Architecture is published by Princeton Architectural Press. It's an 80-page document, and it has a storied history. Steve Hall was one of the key founders of that. Anyway, I think they're on 37 now, but we made a specific project. 16 pages of the 80 pages is dedicated to a new project that we made for Pamphlet Architecture 34, and it had to do with trying to make spatial settings a kind of forensic laboratory for drawings. These are some of the drawings which I made as part of the work. And then Nat Chard's work, whom you should know, Nat_Chard, teaches Unit 25 with Emma Kate Matthews at the Bartlett. I still do work with him. He's made these brilliant drawing machines, drawing instruments. So we made one for me. That's mine. That's Nat's. And what they do, amongst other things, they basically throw paint at each other. Primarily, we wanted to develop our friendship. We have lots of shared interests, and this was a way for us to work on some of those shared interests. We work on them in very, very different ways. But this was a way primarily for our friendship. And I do things by and large for friendships. Work's work, but friendships are by far more important. You know, people like Taka, Carl, others. So these are images from that work. And then we've been fortunate. We've been fortunate to do a pair of exhibitions together, Nat and myself. We also did a month-long workshop in Winnipeg at the ICA Gallery. And these are just some they're images of. We had a room to set up an exhibition of our work. So you can see this is some of Nat's work. He's got a range of work, but these are some of the drawing instruments. This is super, super interesting, smart, dedicated, curious human being. And he's a very, very close friend of mine, and I'm very fortunate to have him and many others as friends. Taka mentioned I was the Bannister Fletcher visiting professor at the Bartlett in 2018 and 19, and Bob Shield, who was the director at the school at the time, I was doing a lot of things at the school. I went 6 times for a week at a time. I was doing a lot of things at the school, and one of the things was Bob asked us to have an exhibition on the ground floor at the Bartlett. So we did that, and these are some of the images from that exhibition. Some of Nat's work, both of our works. The whole ground floor was really, really fun. People there are generous, gracious, built a lot of infrastructure for us to do this. Very, very fortunate. There's our pamphlet work. Photoshop work. Don't know what I'm doing. 4 years ago, I said I need to figure out a little bit about Photoshop. So I set out a charge for myself. I said I'm going to design speculative houses, landscapes, and gardens. So that's what these are. They're basically drone views. I made, normally about midnight to 1 a.m., I made 150 of these in 2018. And I like about 12. I don't throw them away. I don't make heavy judgments about whether I like them or don't like them. I find images. I use sometimes my own drawings. I find an image or two that I like. And then I start to work with them to produce these speculative house, garden, and landscapes. So they keep my conceptual, material, formal vocabularies open. They let me think about domestic practices and what landscapes and gardens might be like. And mostly they're fun. And I developed a few skills. You know, they take 45 minutes to an hour and a half is probably the longest one, and I don't have a clue what I'm doing. I can use the paint tool and the transform tool a little bit and cut some things out and so on, but I don't know what I'm doing. One a days, basically. Super fun. When I make work, to be honest, I don't really care if people are interested in them. If they do, it's fantastic. If it's generous, if I can contribute something to anybody, I'm interested in that. Happy to. I mostly make them because I'm trying to develop skill sets, understandings, conceptual breadth, and so on. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. There are a bunch of them. Just appropriating things. I'm not modeling anything. I'm not drawing anything. I'm not doing any of that. These are two drawings of mine to make this one. Just worked and reworked and fiddled with and so on. One-a-days. It was super, super fun. Just finding stuff. I don't really care if they're good or not good. My interest is not that. My interest is to broaden again what I can think about, techniques for working and so on. I don't say, well, that's good or that stinks or that doesn't. I don't make judgments like that. I keep them all. And there are a half dozen maybe. Like I'd like to develop this one. And you wouldn't just model it. I'm going to show you a couple of images where we just modeled it. So I'm showing you, I don't know, show you 35 of them. Then my friend, great teacher, great architect, Jeff Halstead, saw them. Said, let's try digital modeling. So very, very quickly, using ZBrush, made some visualizations. That's my drawing. This is a sequence of things. We got to get going. Is that where you're coming up here? You're coming up here to do this. Yeah, so we made a sequence of things that I'll move quickly, we're almost finished. So that's me. Those are 2 houses, 2 gardens, and 2 landscapes. Same set of things, new objectives, Photoshop, trying to think about new object, elevation-like things. And I got super interested in the ways I misuse Photoshop, so the paintbrush tool and things that are leaky. I got interested in those things rather than the things. Just some images of those. This is the most interesting drawing out of the set, visualization. Got invited to do, it's on auction. Birdhouse, Italy, 29 other architects in the world. To be auctioned, they just auctioned in the last week. So we made with 3 former students, we worked on a physical object, 3D printed, milled, painted by an auto body painter, feathers, nests. We sent it to Italy. My good friend Mark West saw that. And I said, Mark, having dinner with him one night, and I said, I think I've always thought of that as an ecology. So let's do a collaboration. Mark West, you should also know, survivinglogic.com. So we did a collaboration using some of his images, some of my drawings to try to envision what this might become over and through a temporal structure. Worked on a second bird motel with Simon, another former student, 5-ish years ago. We borrowed some of the same digital modeling components from the first one, but built a second one that's called El Dorado. There are lots of these. There are different versions of them. They float in fictional and real skies. There's a stuffed technology garden, bird alphabet dancing topiary garden, the bird ballroom, dioramic wallpaper in it, sail, blah, blah, blah. So these are some of the final images that we made for that project. Using the architectural representation now to tell stories. Then there's a third bird motel, which is called Skywriter, and it's an homage to Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, and it basically 3D prints Wallace Stevens' poems in the sky. It's all modeled, carefully modeled, rendered, put together as composite images to tell stories about the bird motel. It's an homage to Loger. There are lots of references and things. Working on a 4th bird motel, which is called Tugboat. These are early images from that one. Got a little bit of seed funding from the school, made a project that I called Aerial Diptych Follies. Top part to do with entertainment, the bottom part to do with surveillance. The money that we got used then to ask questions about relationships between images and digital modeling. So this is this is the workspace. We care about everything that moves in there. Just to understand what are the relationships, possible relationships between images and digital modeling. So these are all modeled in Blender. You know, do images have backsides? How do file sizes matter in terms of what's the potential of file sizes? CMYK in relationship to RGB, what kinds of potentials? You know, can we model shadows? Can we model light sources? Can we model notations? And so forth. So these are images all done in Blender. You know, with the wireframe, which shares information with something like a rendering, it's a totally different body of knowledge constructed there. Yeah, everything's modeled in these, everything. It's my drawing. That's what we care about. Enormous potential here. Pay attention to the digital workspace, how softwares work, everything about them. We're touching 3, 4, 5% as architects in terms of digital software, contribution, knowledge construction. So this is the last one. Just super quickly. This is a rendering of the digital model, but that's a piece of cut paper in my drawing. If you just watch that, there. Do images have backsides? We believe so. We believe that paper had that backside. And you can see it in the sort of middle lower left. It's got a front as well. Almost finished. I'm really interested in precedents, historically important things. I got a little bit of seed funding from the school to do with certain kinds of precedents that I was interested in. Linked to triptychs, Baroque domes, and still life painting. So there are 3 strategies. The first one is called niche, and it takes Chinese scroll paintings, Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion, Borromini's church, the San Carlo in Rome, takes a Turkish city, takes a lot of known and important things, the Noli map, and basically we made a venue, a setup to try to understand how those precedents might be talked about differently. So these are images that we're trying to finish now. That's what the setup looks like. These are some images we're working on to do with certain digital histories. There's a second version which takes the same elements and uses knolling as a strategy. These are images of that, taking the same precedents and structuring them through an organizational structure, basically, rather than a scenic theatrical. This is the Borromini table. These are shadow projections of a defunct mosque that's cryptically indexed. There are lots of Shrine Rise, Borromini's dome, so on. And we're trying to make some final images now, which are these. And then there's a third strategy, which reconstructs the great Zen garden at Rio Anji. And there are 6 strategies within this strategy, and I won't go into them. Just show you some images. One's to do with critical fragments, one's to do with reassembling nocturnal models, which this one is, modeling Illustrator, modeling Rhino, modeling Photoshop, and so on. Then there's one called Construction Site, which uses one of my drawings and then stages all those pieces and other things as a world. Here we're trying to use representation generatively, so we're taking all the same pieces and working them. Same. Those were nocturnal ones. These are basically daytime ones. These have recently been published in an AD called Radical Architectural Drawing. Current work, 2080. I'm trying to get 80% of the juice in a project out of 20% of the effort. So I have a series of drawings which I've made. Taka also very, very carefully photographed these. And then the last piece of work is called 6.5 Arcs. Next to last. And we're working on, in the Midwest, there's an idea about 6.5 arcs, which talk to Google Earth and satellite imagery, and they house orphaned animals, and they do work relative to agricultural practices and so on. So these are the very first loose sketches. And then I'll show you two more images called Three Paintings. And it has to do with my interest in using precedents again, and it takes three paintings, images, Vermeer, Raphael's School of Athens, and Caravaggio's Narcissus. And it stages three animal-like objects in a spatial setup. It's not for humans, so no humans would go here. And the objects in the paintings interact with each other to transform one another. So these are early drawings made a month ago. It's the only work that I've done in the last. Now these were made earlier. They were made, I haven't done anything in 4 months. They were made 4 months ago. So that's it. That's all I got. Thank you very much for your attention and hanging around this long. You're welcome. It's great to be here with all of you. Fly it high, people. Fly it high. It's your generation.
Does anyone have a question?
You can ask me anything. Need a microphone. I can hear that. What schools have I taught at? I've taught at Arizona State, I've taught at SCIARC, I've taught at Penn, I've taught at the Bartlett, and I've taught at the University of Michigan and the Otis College of Art and Design. It's a super easy question. Are there easier ones than that? I've been very, very lucky. I don't know what I'm doing. I've been very, very lucky to be around amazing people like you, institutions, working with people, Eisenman, Denise and Bob Stern. I've been very, very, very lucky. Did a little bit of teaching, sort of half teaching, not teaching, not really at Cambridge. I was involved at Cambridge a bit when I was there. Other questions? Yeah, please.
Hey, Perry, thanks for coming.
Of course.
You talked about getting 80% of the work out of 20% of the juice, right? And you're taking things like precedents and you're abstracting them, you're using them syntactically to develop new ways of thinking about them. How do you determine at what level of abstraction, at what percentage of work needs to be produced so as to not lose the original meaning you want?
Yeah.
Or to construct a new meaning?
So that's a straightforward and a really, really good question. It's an insightful, penetrating question. It's a really, really complex answer. So the 2080 is not to do with the precedents. Those are different pieces of work. 2080, just to be clear about that, all of my work is like sticky, gooey, lots of stuff going on. So I wonder, just as a form of critical reflection, could I get 80% of the content in 20% of, let's say, the spatial or representational effort? Budget cut. So that's to do with that. The precedence one is a more complex one. And the question about degrees of abstraction, it has to do again with relational structuring. It has to do with the work that particular elements in a piece of work do to then try to register the legibility or not of aspects of drawings or work. So when I talk about relational assemblies, I believe we perceive according to relational assemblies that are temporally structured. So we grasp certain relational assemblies and participate with them. When I was driving here, I passed a car, it passed me, license plate California. There were some autumn trees in the background. The relational assembly, I'm from California, so I immediately snapped to our cabin in the Sierra Nevada. That's a relational assembly. I'm driving, trying to get here to hang out with all you characters. And so I think about things in relational assemblies that are always in dynamic fluctuation. So the question about the degrees to which I talk about things as having communicative potential. I don't talk about meaning or content. Those are too specific normally, but communicative potential then has to do with the question about the measure of degrees of abstraction, of tangibility, of structures of reference in terms of some part of a drawing or spatial setup. So it's a bit like a playwright trying to work out what the different characters in the spatial setup or representational setup do. So one might be purely abstract and there is a vehicle to camouflage other diagrammatic relationships in the spatial setup. In my thinking, not your, you don't have to, I don't want anybody to be me. That's the last thing in the world you want to be. So it's very, very complex. The answer to the question is always situated in a piece of work to decide what are the proximities or distances between structures of reference and association or participating with whatever's at stake in a representation or a spatial setup or something like that. Yes, please. I don't hear so well, so that's why I'm not trying to invade your space. Okay.
Thanks for coming.
Of course.
One question. When I look at your drawings, they're beautiful, so I start.
Thank you. It's very kind of you.
They're amazing drawings, but I feel that to understand them, I need to understand your own language, and I need to understand the way you talk. It's not really English, it's more like poetry, like more abstract, and more like a higher level, really abstract.
I don't know about a higher level, but it's something else that's, yeah.
So like, I don't know, like if you feel that is this intentional, or, because I feel that your drawings have a temporality, because like there are many elements involved, I really want to spend a lot of time trying to understand what the relations that you're creating, but there's also like knowing about the author.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a beautiful, your name is?
Sarah.
Sarah, and you're, sorry?
Johnny.
Johnny, yes, you are still Johnny.
Yeah.
I know that.
I think you recognize it.
And I remember, yes. Sarah. Again, that's a complex, I wish I had super simple answers. So when Amy and I were married, we would talk about our work with some frequency. She'd come down in the basement and look at a drawing and she'd say, I have no idea what you're, relative to what we've been talking about, I have no real idea what you're talking about. So I don't mean this in a dismissive way, but when I work, I don't care if other people understand the worksheets. These are worksheets. I now care in a different way because I've been grateful to be asked to participate in a fair number of exhibitions in the world. So now that's another parameter where when I was working in LA, I just worked in a bedroom. And I could basically work on what I worked on. And then a couple of people saw some landscape drawings and then blah, blah, blah. So that's another parameter now that I need to care for, the legibilities or not of certain kinds of representations that I work on. That matters to me. What I think is important is that I think in these kinds of drawings, there are different kinds of drawings. The landscapes are different than Photoshop things, which are different than these. They're different in kind. What for me is helpful is in these kinds of drawings, there are enough things that are recognizable often, whether it's map-like things or whether it's figurative things or a style of technique for working, that it allows people of different persuasions or interests or desires into the drawing or drawings in some way. That's the first part of the answer. The second part is I basically, when I work, I want to know about 60%. I want to sort of be in control, not as an egotistical thing, but I want to know 60% of what I'm working on. I don't mind the other 40% being wild. I don't know. I can't explain that. That's uncertain to me. When I was a student like you, everything needed to be spot on. Ideas nailed into the work, could talk about it, everything could be talked about. Now, I don't give a toss about that. Because those indeterminacies are normally places where people can take ownership of the work and produce their own stories, rather than me figuring everything out like programs do. There are programs, they're great, but they tell you what to do, basically. So I'm interested in things like indeterminacy and becoming and emergence. There are a number of terminologies which have to do with things that are transformative, are changing, that we can take ownership, we can take possession of, not being told by the architect what to do. This is a great building. It's a great building, but it predicts what you do. I would like to work in this building, but it basically predicts what you do. Programs. Yes, Andrea, please.
So
This is a good question. So I haven't, I haven't had to worry about that in some time. I don't have clients, but if I did, there are a number of techniques that I would use to bring them along. First of all, I would pull a wooden pencil out of my pocket and say, this is a pencil. But then I would say it also belongs to, its relational field belongs to deforestation, mass production, censorship because there's an eraser on the end, the history of writing or drawing is embedded in the pencil. So we need to think about things, we think about program a little bit that way, that it is a naming convention, but it has all kinds of other things in its relational field. So that would be the first thing. I would use analogous thinking probably a lot. Likenesses, so imagine that this is like, you know, going to a circus and is a theatrical setting, So that would be something that I would bring them along using analogous. So they could attach to things outside of me talking about crazy stuff, you know, painting, big paintings, oversized paintings that are dealing with animal objects. And so I would try to build analogic relationships would be a key thing. You know, I would try to simply set out just the values and ethics of what I do and why I do it. That would be a key thing, just to say, you know, you may want someone else to work with you, but these are if you work with me, then these are things that come with me. So it's a good question. I'd like to have a client. Anybody got deep pockets in here? Want to waste your money? Other questions? I'm happy to try to take a whack at anything. Okay. Yep. Do you want me to give that to you? Yeah. Anyway, yes, please. Yeah.
For you always have like abstract as this, like your thinking is very different compared to like a lot of people. Like a lot of people are very formed in their thinking, but you're just very wild. Was it always like that?
Your name is? Jason. I think about what I do, Jason, to be perfectly honest with you, as totally normative. It's very, very conservative work, let's say, relative to what's conceptually possible. So that's part of the answer. Maybe people look at it and say, well, you know, some of this work doesn't look like things that I easily recognize. When I started to teach at SciArc, I was teaching amongst people that I really revered. I mean, Maine and Moss and Mangurian and Denari, and mostly there were a lot of men, sadly, men. I said, boy, I got to figure out, I'm a little piker here. I just turned up and someone invited me, Mangurian invited me to teach at the school. I need to figure out a way into this conversation. So that's when the architectural drawings started to open up a little bit. And I mean, the language is super specific. You can ask Taka, just working with the students in the school. I use language in really specific ways. I'm not a good writer, I'm not a good speaker, but I develop terms and phrases and sequences of thinking verbally, but also here that it's complicated probably. My good friend Tom Burrish, who used to be the chair at Michigan, was the chair at Berkeley, and has just recently retired. I taught with him at SciArc for years, very, very close friend. He said, what I'd like to do is put a video camera over your work table and wire your brain to basically a seismograph and see how this looks. Because when I work properly, it's very, very complex. It's not known, but there are a lot of things. You know, if I'm trying to set up that series of relationships within the drawing, oh, that reminds me of a film clip from a vendor's film. I then go and watch that and I say, oh, I need to diagram that, but when I diagram that, that releases this other part of the drawing into that, and that opens up a reference to a previous piece of work, and that's a little bit the way it goes on here. But what's been valuable to me, and I'm not an old, I'm old, but my imagination is decent. But I still think there's something in the manual process of making things that really matters to me a lot in terms of visualizing the complex things that I've got going on. And so I still believe in that, in the making of things, construction lines and where the templates are and how I move around the workspace as potential. I still believe in that as a way. So when we're making digital images, they feel super, whether they're digital models or me working in Photoshop, They seem super, super, super thin to me. Desert house, you know, chrome shadows, those are relative to what I'm thinking about and trying to work through in the earlier drawings. They're very, very, very thin because they don't have aspects of making. They're images, they're mostly images, and they're not really working on things that can't be subscribed to as images and so on. So I'm a bit apologetic. I love the characters that I work with. They're incredibly talented. And they collaborate. I ask them, you know, just modeling stuff. But the work is really, really thin, to be honest. Not because, nothing to do with them. Nothing to do with them. Because of the way it's worked on. And it's worked on quickly with no money. I pay everybody that works with me, and so I don't have very much money. So the work's, yeah. It needs, that's why I said that desert house, it needs 300-400 hours probably just to say, okay, it's getting nearby. And it wouldn't look like that. So when I work, there's a lot of stuff going on. I enjoy that. It's a cosmology. It's a world construction. I'm in it. When I'm working properly, I'm there. Yeah, the world can be doing whatever it's doing. I'm in the work. All right? Okay. Super great to see all of you. Thank you again for turning up. And is it still Tuesday? It is, isn't it? It is. All right, cool. All right, thank you very much.